Welcome to Talking Feds One-on-One, deep dive discussions with national figures about the most fascinating and consequential issues defining our culture and shaping our lives. I'm your host, Harry Littman. Welcome to another Talking Feds One-on-One. With the important exception of the pardons of the January 6 offenders, almost every action that Trump has undertaken in his first few days in office has come by way of executive order. That makes it paramount to understand the general legal contours governing what can and can't be done by executive order, as well as how that law applies to some of the more prominent Trump orders. For that sort of legal question, my go-to source always is Steve Vladeck. Steve, who now, this year, his first year at Georgetown as the Agnes Williams Sesquicentennial Professor of Federal Courts, also the Supreme Court analyst for CNN and co-host of the National Security Law podcast, as well as an active appellate advocate, including at the High Court. His book, The Shadow Docket, was a New York Times bestseller, and we covered it previously. I personally get my news in a wide array of sources, but I'm a paid subscriber to fewer than a handful of Substacks. One of those is Steve's, entitled One First, which I highly recommend and has all kinds of information, not simply about the Supreme Court, but as we're going to find out, his entry today goes more broadly and talks about the Department of Justice. Agnes Williams Sesquicentennial Professor of Federal Court, Steve Vladeck, thank you as always for joining.
Thanks for having me, Harry. I need a shorter title.
Exactly. You had a great one down in Texas. It was Charles Allen Wright, Professor of Federal Courts.
Yep. No, I think that's the best I can do.
Right. All right. So let's just talk briefly about the general law of executive orders. I think people are confused, and some of them think that Trump can simply wave a wand and overcome statutes and the like. As a general matter, what do executive orders do and what do they not do?
Sure. So executive orders are not per se controversial. Executive orders are basically the principal way in which the president directs people in the executive branch to do things. It's the formal way that he does that. And that can be, Harry, because he is relying upon his interpretation of a statute or the Constitution. It could be because he's clarifying some position. He could be rescinding an executive order entered by one of his predecessors. The mere fact that something is an executive order does not make it in any way suspect. The question is, what is the executive order purporting to do? So an executive order that says, I proclaim tomorrow national, January 24th day, right, is not exactly going to get anyone's hackles up. Whereas an executive order that says, I am instructing every single immigration officer to stop recognizing citizenship for people born to, parents who meet these various conditions, that's a much bigger deal. So executive orders are not of themselves like controversial. It's how presidents use them, and when, especially, Harry, they're using them to change settled understandings of the Constitution and or federal law, to take actions that might be in violation of the Constitution or federal law. And that's where we are with at least some of these Trump orders.
Okay, fair enough. Just a couple quick comments. So the basic idea is he's telling the executive branch what to do. Sometimes the executive branch is such a powerful player in society and the economy that can have overlapping impact, but nevertheless, that's what is happening. And your basic contours, I think I would just do the gloss from a well-known Supreme Court case that if the president is sort of flying in the face of a congressional command, that he is at his weakest in trying to effectuate things.
His lowest ebb.
Lowest ebb, as Justice Jackson put it in the Youngstown Tube case. So I want to talk about a couple in particular, and one of them, your Substack today, to which I recommend everyone, actually thinks about this a little in terms of the commands that he has issued to the Department of Justice itself and what that might mean for the department's overall credibility. But let's start with Tik Tok, where he, before he was president, tried to tell the Supreme Court, oh, just make this, put this on ice for a while so I can do my great deal making prowess. And of course, Supreme Court, that's not what courts do. They can hold things up as unconstitutional, but they don't simply do good policy of, oh, it'd be great to have Trump weigh in. Now he takes office, and I think a lot of people think that with his executive order, he has somehow suspended the or stopped the clock and made TikTok still operative, notwithstanding that Congress passed a law that after a certain expansive time made it effectuate as of January 19th, the day before he was inaugurated. So what's he trying to do with TikTok, and what's your sense of the kind of limits he may be pushing in the executive order realm?
Sure. I mean, so Trump is trying basically to get around the statute. And the executive order he issued on Monday does this in two different respects. The first is it promises that for at least 75 days, the Justice Department is not going to enforce the TikTok statute. And the idea there is, hey, don't worry if you violate the statute by supporting TikTok, Apple or Google or other US companies. We're not going to prosecute you. We're not going to fine you. Basically, you'll be fine. And then in a second provision, which I find even more shocking, it instructs the Attorney General to basically provide letters to all U.S. providers reflecting the Attorney General's determination that supporting TikTok does not actually violate the statute. So, Harry, the first part of that is like, we're not going to enforce. And we have examples.
And how's that working with the Apples and Googles of the world?
Well, so the Apples and Googles of the world have smart lawyers who know that the statute of limitations is 5 years and know that just because Trump is not enforcing it today doesn't mean that they can't have it enforced against them tomorrow, which is why we're not seeing, full-throated support and reinstatement of TikTok on app stores, et cetera.
And I'll just say something briefly, which is that the statute's draconian. The penalties that could be imposed anytime in the next 5 years are per use.
Yes.
So anytime somebody employs TikTok through Google, you can that adds up pretty quick. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and that's right, which is why, I think a lot of this is sort of pie in the sky. The press attention so far has been focused on that first part, which is Section 2A, which is like, hey, we're not going to enforce it for 75 days. Harry, you and I know lots of examples of statutes presidents have said they're not going to enforce. President Obama, right, said he wouldn't enforce the Controlled Substances Act with regard to marijuana in Colorado. It's one debate, right? What I find shocking about the executive order is Section 2C, where it says, and the Attorney General is going to determine that you're not violating the statute. And it's like, that's basically saying, we want the Attorney General to sign a piece of paper that says 2 + 2 = bananas. And it's just, you have more experience here than I do. I can't imagine being a Justice Department lawyer who's being told by the president not just which legal conclusion to reach, but a conclusion that is manifestly irreconcilable with the statute, right? It's one thing to say we're not going to enforce the statute. It's another thing to say the statute doesn't actually mean anything. And that's what I find so frustrating and concerning about the TikTok order.
Yeah, as I've pushed on things in the last, couple weeks, it's more than this is a general theme, which is on any of the more controversial or visible Trump efforts. There's always a lie at the bottom, and this is the lie here. And then there's another provision in the statute that he could try to invoke, but that would also be a lie. But the statute itself says, okay, we can suspend things. I forget if it's 75 or 90 days. If you, Mr. President, say that basically you've got a bona fide purchaser and you're putting it all together, and you can see whether he'll do that. I think this kind of power also will come up soon in the when we talk about immigration, but it would be false because there's just no way in the world that China is going to permit ByteDance to sell, notwithstanding the importance of the U.S. market. When the dust is settled, there's not going to be a buyer in the U.S. Okay, so you would say, this just in, on the birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment, a district judge in the Ninth Circuit has enjoined it and said you can't do that. what would be your assessment of Trump's prospects? And let's not assume that he draws, or the department draws an Eileen Cannon, but just a sort of down the middle judge. Would you say this is basically DOA or sort of more a fighting chance?
I mean, they drew a pretty down-the-middle judge in Seattle. The judge who issued the TRO, Judge Kugenauer, is a Reagan appointee. I mean, a moderate one, but, a Reagan appointee. I've thought, Harry, all along that of all of the radical immigration policies that then candidate Trump was proposing and that, President Trump is already pursuing, that restricting birthright citizenship was always going to be the lowest hanging fruit for the courts.
In the sense that the courts would strike it down as a contradiction of the 14th Amendment language. Yeah. So, okay.
And the relevant statute. I mean, there's a birthright citizenship statute too, right? I still feel that way. I mean, I understand that, folks have been understandably scandalized by behavior of the federal courts, including the Supreme Court over the last couple of years. But, I just don't see a world where there are more than 3 votes on the Supreme Court to rewrite the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment.
And I agree, by the way. But let's talk Tik Tok. I'll say that 5 times fast. In other words, I agree that this is a bridge too far including for this Supreme Court. But how do you handicap the challenges to what he's doing in the Tik Tok law, which, as you say, certainly seem out of the box to be flatly inconsistent with Congress's command?
I mean, Harry, I think we've already seen companies that I think are rightfully wary that the executive order is enough to get them out of potential liability for violating the statute. And so, I think that this is not a stable long-term solution for TikTok. Whether the long-term solution is for Congress to repeal the statute or for Trump to find some other way to get this, to work around this. Just this executive order is a Band-Aid, and it's a leaky Band-Aid at that. And so I don't know that this ends up in the courts, Harry, the same way that birthright citizenship does, but this is not the fix for TikTok that President Trump had promised. And if anything, it's, that much more alarming, the lengths to which he's going for what really isn't going to hold up anyway.
Yeah, so this is an excellent point. Almost always, a very good example is birthright citizenship, where, within the first day, several lawsuits are filed. There are occasional instances where social debates are resolved not with lawsuits, and here would be a good example where, as long as Google and Apple and others stay their hand, then the law is effectively, remains on the books. And I also agree with you here that it's, as a matter of executive order, the sort of fiat of we interpret the law that's, otherwise and stand it on its head will not prevail. And we're talking about a fairly short timeline anyway. There is the possibility, this is the only thing I really see as a prospect, that Congress enacts a kind of new law that says you've got 90 days, Mr. President, do your best. But what Trump does on his own, I think, won't do it. And even if Congress were to issue that law, I don't think Trump is going to be able to make any headway. So it'll be interesting how this works out. Basically, if Congress holds to the position, which they did somewhat, with not that, people were kind of caught by surprise as we came to the deadline that, holy shit, TikTok might be gone. If they hold to that view, I don't see Trump's having the legal power to do anything. All right, let's move to what I think is a trickier issue, and you've adverted to it a couple times. And I want to repeat that your Substack, excellent, as always, Substack entry of today views this through the prism of the Department of Justice and the way the new administration is looking to essentially boss around the DOJ so as to make their policy vision happen. But so immigration, as you say, Trump has issued an order saying many things, but one of them is there's an emergency here, notwithstanding that the crossings at the southern border where he's declared the emergency are at a 4-year low. And as a result, he would be able, if that were a valid executive order, to call on certain additional military powers. I think we have the prospect of state National Guards and the feds coming in and doing roundups of immigrants. It's just going to be a complete horror show. But this, to me, raises the point of where the president has the power to make a legally important or pivotal determination, but he lies about it, essentially, not to put too fine a point on it. How much deference we expect the courts to give, and will, they just kind of go along with this phony baloney emergency because they see it as within his bailiwick, and in that sense, does the executive order prevail?
So I think we should be careful about exactly what the emergency declarations are doing, right? So declaring a national emergency is not some sort of open-ended, I can therefore do what I want. We do not, in fact, have the Enabling Act that, Weimar Germany and the Nazi, that basically, right? So rather, what declaring a national emergency does is it triggers, or Harry, it opens the door to a bunch of sort of more specific standby statutes. And some of those allow the president to suspend certain procedures or to access certain pools of money or to use certain resources he otherwise couldn't tap into.
And don't they include certain military personnel? Doesn't it also permit him to call out state National Guards and such?
Yeah, but I mean, the reality is that he could have done that anyway.
Oh, okay.
Right. I mean, so we've been using National Guard to support border operations for a while now. I mean, this is just, I think, more about the manpower than the principle. But the larger point, though, Harry, I mean, your question's the right one, which is, will courts ever really second guess his assertion that this is an emergency and that we're being invaded? And I don't know. I mean, some of this is uncharted territory. During the first Trump administration, when Trump declared what was just a sham emergency so he could free up military construction funds to build the border wall, that was blocked by the lower courts, right? Not necessarily on the ground that it wasn't an emergency, but that the military construction fund statute just didn't apply. On the flip side, right, when he declared an emergency to justify imposing steel tariffs against Canada, that was upheld by the lower courts. And the Supreme Court never really weighed in on that because those cases went away right at the end of the Trump administration. So, I think the reality is, yes, there are some statutes that Trump can rely upon, or at least try to rely upon, because of these assertions he's made. That makes it harder to challenge these actions in court. I don't think, Harry, it makes it impossible.
I'm deferring to your greater expertise, but this is one that my best guess, and it's always precarious, where will the Supreme Court, which I think has no love lost for Trump himself, but there for a welter of complicated reasons tends to really throw him some big bones. My best guess is that this one, if it were to get to the court, they would uphold a sort of hyper-deferential principle that would just say, would just kind of blink away the fact that it's just palpably false. They wouldn't. I mean, this is one thing that basically came up in the immunity opinion. You can't sort of try to second guess reasoning and the like. But yeah,
but I guess I'm a little less fatalistic, Harry, because during the first Trump administration, I mean, yes, the Supreme Court upheld the third iteration of the travel ban based on what were completely preposterous assertions about the factual predicate for the policy. But, it blocked most of the second, and the first was, so persuasively blocked by lower courts that Trump didn't even appeal that to the Supreme Court. So I think you're probably right, but I also think that this Supreme Court knows that we're in a different political moment where it can't count on Congress, I think, to do anything, where I think the court understands, or at least John Roberts understands, that really it's the court and nobody else that's going to be a speed break.
In part because of the court's actions, kind of disempowering Congress.
Well,
but yeah.
I mean, that there is that. I mean, yeah. Yes, but right. But that also, I think, might lend itself to feeling some additional responsibility on Roberts' part to be a bit of a speed break here. And so, listen, I don't think this court is going to block everything Trump is trying to do that's controversial, but I do think it's going to block more than those who have become completely jaded about the court might expect.
Yeah, it could be. And I try hard to think about the court as a whole also and not just count to five. I would say the ultimate glass half full, half empty moment to me was when the court did narrowly uphold the sentence being pronounced in New York, but I thought there was no even make weight argument against it, and that there were 4 votes, including Kavanaugh, who was so often in the majority, to grant that stay. Sort of left me with chills down my spine.
Talking Feds is supported by the Brennan Center for Justice. In this new political era, the Brennan Center will do what they do best: defend the Constitution and the rule of law. They're prepared to fight against presidential overreach and will continue advocating for reforms to resist weaponized government, stop billionaires from corrupting our elections, and ensure every eligible American has the freedom to vote. Stay informed by visiting BrennanCenter.org.
All right, I'd like to think about this as I was saying at the top. You have a very, I think, sophisticated view of government institutions generally and their interplay and sort of their, waning and waxing of power. So your today's Substack takes up some of these issues, but through the important vantage point of the apparent plans to deploy the DOJ, my old stomping grounds, and they've issued a series of orders. The most recent outside, even though it's not part of what you've talked about today, is where they've basically ordered U.S. attorneys to try to make cases of impeding federal enforcement efforts of the immigration ban, actual criminal cases against states and localities. But your current entry, again, which I recommend to all, has this sophisticated extra nuance of what are they doing with and do they intend to do with the Department of Justice more than simply proclaim things in executive orders. Can you talk to that some?
It's a bit hard to quantify, Harry, but I mean, you know this well, that the Department of Justice is not just a law firm. And, when lawyers walk into court and say that they're appearing on behalf of the United States, that has historically meant a lot more than just I'm appearing on behalf of the current president, right? And that it has meant that I am speaking with the weight of the federal government, that I have interests that transcend the politics of the moment, that there is at least some fidelity to longer-term legal principles and not just what is politically expedient. And, Harry, there are obviously flashpoints in recent years where that's been tested. But here we are, 3.5 days into the Trump administration, and we're just throwing it to the wind. So, we talked about the Tik Tok order and how it basically instructs the attorney general to conclude something that's just laughably, frivolously wrong about the law. The death penalty executive order.
Wow. Yeah, talk about that for a minute, please.
Yeah, so there's among the flurry of executive orders was this incredibly, I think this is a fair, bloodthirsty, right, executive order on the death penalty that basically says, hey, we're going to look, DOJ, I want you to look for more cases you can prosecute as capital cases. DOJ, I want you to help local and state prosecutors with their capital cases. DOJ, I want you to help states find execution drugs, right? And then the last part is, and DOJ, I want you to argue to the Supreme Court to overrule any precedent that makes it harder for states or the federal government to execute people.
And that fourth one is really just breathtaking, right? I mean, presumably the Supreme Court has said the Constitution requires this or that from the Eighth Amendment. As long as it permitted somebody on death row to survive, we are, for that reason and that reason alone, we are going to go after it. That's truly stunning.
And it would be one thing, right? I mean, it would be one thing for DOJ to show up in front of the Supreme Court and say, hey, Supreme Court, we really think that this precedent should be overturned because it's wrong. That's not what this is. This is, we want you to argue for overturning precedents to get out of the way of our policy. And it's which precedents? All of them. Do capital defendants have a right to a lawyer? Do capital defendants have a right to be tried by a jury? Do they have a right to confront witnesses against them? Like, these are bedrock principles of our criminal justice system that, the Trump administration says, well, go argue against them just so that we can execute more people. As a matter of policy, Harry, it's horrifying. But my question is, what does it do the next time, the Solicitor General stands up in the Supreme Court and says, trust us?
And by the way, the Solicitor General and the Deputy Attorney are people who have put together a very checkered record of advocacy with very tendentious and weak positions because they represented Trump personally in his legal battles going, before he was elected. Talk a little bit more about, if you don't mind, because this is a big theme in your subsection, about credibility, about, what it will. So Supreme Court's one thing, but, AUSAs around the country standing up and saying Steve Vladeck for the United States. And we have certain judges, I would point to the D.C. District Bench, who really are completely apoplectic at the pardons. But, what's it going to mean for juries and for judges, et cetera, for the overall credibility of people around the country who work for the Department of Justice?
I mean, nothing good, Harry, right? And the reason why I worry about that is, that might be satisfying in the short term. But, we depend upon the Department of Justice to enforce plenty of things that we care a lot about. I mean, especially these days, as the Supreme Court has made it harder for private citizens to enforce a bunch of federal laws, right? We need DOJ. And so a DOJ that has lost its institutional credibility is a DOJ that's going to have a much harder time winning the cases, Harry, that you and I agree it ought to win. And that has much longer term consequences.
Not just you and I, a lot of people do. And this is a really broad feeling within the department. I'm here to tell you, I was there last week in the waning days, and people were, all these U.S. attorneys resigned, whereas they normally would have gone till May or June for orderly transition. I was in that position. They didn't want to have to, swallow these orders and do things that they thought would, at a minimum, be in tension with their duty of candor to the court and the overall mission of the department, to which that they so completely believe in and cherish, of doing the right thing. So yeah, the institutional erosion. I mean, already some very important people were basically, it's hard to fire them. They know that, but we're given, you can do some asset forfeiture in Alaska or the equivalent, and then others have left. And now the career staff at that message is coming home to them, and they are the heart and soul of the department. So I think you're really right to view some of these things through the prism of how it's going to affect the Department of Justice. And, I think you've been similarly alarmed as I have in the last few days, but in general, there are certain erosions of democratic norms that even if you claw them back and the Democrats win the midterms or 4 years from now Trump is gone, they don't necessarily bounce back in the same way. And if there's a true cost exacted on the credibility of the Department of Justice, that's bad news for the Department of Justice, bad news for the country, and not something you snap your fingers to restore when Trump rule ends.
I couldn't put it any better, Harry. That's exactly right.
All right, well, there's an end. I hope we'll talk to you more, especially as we see the progress of these executive orders in the court. As I say, we've already had one, the most sort of far-fetched on birthright citizenship, enjoined as, I think, flagrantly unconstitutional, were the words of the Seattle District Court judge. We'll see how the others fare, but also we'll see, and hopefully I'll have some vantage point on what's doing in the good old Department of Justice. Steve, thanks as always for being here. Hope to see you soon.
Thanks for having me, Harry. Great to see you.
Thank you for tuning in to One on One, a weekly conversation series from Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we post full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Talking Feds remains one of the very few independent productions out there, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Plus, you'll get tons of perks like free access to my LA Times op-eds and the chance to join monthly live Q&A sessions. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds One-on-One is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McArdle, Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mehendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Genesis Magpayo. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.